Welcome to another social studies mini lesson. So this time we're looking at the principles of American government. There are 6, in fact. So these are concepts that you really should know about for the GED. There are 6 key principles of American government. There is popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. So these 6 key principles or ideas are basically what led to the building of our government and all its systems. This is what it all rests upon, these philosophies, if you will. Let's talk about them. So starting with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is based on this idea that government is created by and subject to the will of the people. Foundational idea in American history and American government. So therefore, under this idea, citizens of the country are in charge of the government and how it is run. But what does that look like? Well, in our particular situation in the U.S., the way that citizens are in charge of the government, the way citizens help run the country, is by voting. So citizens are able to vote for their representatives in government, and along with that, obviously, citizens can run for office. They can decide how big of a role they want to play in their government. Elected officials represent the people of their area and the opinions of those people, at least in theory. Now, there are obviously plenty of times when elected officials don't represent the will of the people who voted for them. And what typically happens is they don't get elected again. So that's popular sovereignty. So I'd like to turn your attention to a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who wrote a book explaining to the people of France how the American democracy worked. So he was basically an eyewitness to quite a bit of American history. He came over here, traveled, talked to a lot of people, wrote his book. De Tocqueville wrote, "Our contemporaries are constantly excited by 2 conflicting passions. They want to be led and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once." So in other words, he's saying, people at their core want someone else to lead them or be in charge of them, but at the same time, people at their core want to be as free as possible, and those 2 things contradict one another. So what's cool about the American system, especially at the time in history when it was created, is we actually tried to build a government where we could do both, where people could be led, but could also be as free as possible. So going back to de Tocqueville, they devise a sole tutelary means like something that is protected by someone, an all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite or a break. They console themselves for being in tutelage or under the protection of someone else by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. In other words, even though Americans aren't necessarily as free as we might want to be, because we can't do absolutely anything we want, we do have rules we have to follow, we have this comforting fact that we vote for the people who write our laws. All right, going back to Tocqueville. Every man allows himself to be put in leading strings. Leading strings way, way, way back in the past, they were literal straps that were sewn onto the clothing of little children before they could walk. And the way you would teach them to walk is by holding these straps, and it would kind of support them via their clothing and take a little bit of the weight off of their legs, and then they could slowly learn how to walk. That's leading strings. So every man allows himself to be put into leading strings because he sees that it is not a person or class of persons, but the people at large that holds the end of his chain. And what Tocqueville is saying there is we as people restrict our own freedom willingly, follow our laws. We built this system because it was different from a monarchy. We weren't going to be beholden to just one person or like a dictator, and we weren't going to be beholden in theory to just one social class. Instead, we, the people, would elect the people who ruled us. So we would have a say in who was doing the ruling, and in theory, a say in the rules. All right, our second principle of government is the idea of limited government. So who's doing the limiting? We, the people. The idea of limited government is this idea that you don't want the government to have too much power. You don't want the people to give away all their rights. So our limited government defines how much actual power the government can have, and that depends on how much power the people give the government. At different times in American history, people have had greater or fewer freedoms depending on what the government at the time was doing and was allowed to do. Sometimes in a crisis like, say, World War II, we have some of our freedoms curtailed in the name of national security. And then later we gain that power back, at least in theory, because we're no longer in a crisis. This idea of limited government is largely built on this quote from Thomas Jefferson. A government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. So in the United States, there has always been kind of a tension between how big do we let government get? How many elected officials do we have? How much power do we give the government? How many laws do we have? How many things do we want the government to actually regulate? And as the country has grown, the government has necessarily had to grow, but at the same time, we've tried not to let it grow too big. Next principle, separation of powers. So the United States does not have a dictatorship. We don't have a monarchy. Our president is not an absolute ruler. He can't do whatever he wants. He doesn't make the laws. Nope. Instead, we have 3 co-equal branches. That's very important. Co-equal branches. We don't have one branch that has more power, at least in theory, according to our Constitution. The 3 branches of government have equal amounts of power. We have the legislative branch, that's Congress. They make the laws. We have the executive branch, that would be the president and his staff. They enforce the laws. And we have the judicial, Supreme Court, other courts. They decide the punishment for those who break the law. By separating powers, it ensures that no single branch can control the country. So many people mistakenly believe that the president is all powerful or that the executive branch is the most powerful branch of government. That's not true, and that's not according to our Constitution. 3 equal branches. The head of the legislative branch is the U.S. Capitol. The headquarters of the executive branch would be the White House. Headquarters of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. Our legislative branch is comprised of Congress, which is bicameral, 2 houses. We have the House of Representatives, and we have the Senate. Then in the White House, our executive branch, we have the president, we have the vice president, and then of course they have all sorts of secretaries and staff under them. Judicial branch, we have the Supreme Court, then we have all these lower courts under them. Now, because we have this tricameral government, 3 different sections of government, that creates for us checks and balances. This idea of checks and balances was designed to keep each branch of government from getting too much power. The 3 branches are dependent upon each other. That's how they were created, is to be dependent upon one another. But they're also deliberately meant to be in opposition to one another. That was a key early idea when our country was founded. If the 3 branches of government are in a little bit of opposition to each other, keep some friction going, and it means that they will check the power of one another. See, if the judicial branch and the legislative branch always do whatever the executive branch wants, the executive branch would end up becoming more powerful. And instead of a president, you would eventually have a dictator. We wouldn't want that to happen. So by setting it up so that the judicial branch and the legislative branch are necessary to the executive branch, it can't function without them, and they have powers that it wants, it creates this tension that in theory keeps the branches equal. Doesn't always work perfectly, but this is the theory behind it. So in other words, our system is deliberately inefficient. If you've ever complained about how slowly the US government works, it was designed that way. Think about when our government was created. We were just coming out of a giant revolution, a war. People were terrified of change happening too quickly, because that's what happens in a revolution, is change happens so quickly, people don't have time to adjust to it. It's scary. So they wanted the system to normally move slower. And while that's great in theory, sometimes there have been some growing pains. Sometimes we wish it would be more efficient. But at the same time, that slower system has protected us at many times in our history. So our Constitution creates our three branches and lays out exactly what their role is and what their power is. Let's look at how these three branches interact with one another. So starting with the executive branch and how it interacts with the legislative branch. The executive branch, or the president, has the power to veto bills. In other words, when Congress, the two houses, agree on a bill and they want to sign that bill into law, it has to go to the president's desk. The president has the power to say, yes, I agree with this law and sign it, or he has the power to say, no, I don't agree with it. The executive branch, or the president, has the power to recommend but not create legislation. So when we vote for president, they always campaign on various promises and ideas of what they would do if they became president. What they do once they become president is they recommend legislation based on that to the legislative branch. And the legislative branch might act on those suggestions, or if they're in opposition to the executive branch, like if the legislative branch is led by a different political party than the executive branch, sometimes they won't do very much of what he wants. The executive branch can also call special sessions of Congress. So the president has the power to force Congress to meet to discuss something. How the executive branch interacts with the judicial branch now. The president has the power to appoint judges and fill vacancies. He gets his list of suggested judges. He decides. Now, he doesn't do this entirely on his own. He's guided. Think about it. In order to have power, people had to put you in power. So you've usually got some lobbyists and some special interest groups and various individuals who exercise a certain amount of sway over you. So it's not the president just willy-nilly doing what he wants. He is beholden to the other members of his party and oftentimes to special interest groups. So he can appoint judges and fill vacancies on the benches. He can also grant reprieves and pardons. So if the judicial branch, for example, sentences someone to death and the president doesn't agree with that death sentence, he can overturn that and pardon the individual. Now, that doesn't mean the person leaves prison. They probably will still serve a prison term, but they've been granted their life. All right, legislative branch. So the legislative branch, when they interact with the executive branch, has the power to override the presidential veto. So there's a bit of back and forth. Legislative branch, they write this bill, they send it to the president to be signed into law. He says no. They actually have a process where they can then override him and still pass it. But it's hard and it's arduous and slow. They can control appropriations. They can ratify treaties. The legislative branch has the power to declare war, not the president. The president does not have the power to declare war. Let that sink in. Now, he's the one who makes the announcement, but the legislative branch is the one that gives him the authority to do it. He has to have their permission first. That's in the Constitution. The legislative branch can refuse presidential appointments. Say the president wants to name so-and-so to the head of this government organization. If the legislative branch doesn't agree that person's qualified or they don't like them, they can refuse to appoint them. The legislative branch also has the power to impeach and remove the president. That's a necessary check on power because you don't want a president not following the laws and being able to get away with it. So we've built into our system a way that a president can be removed if necessary. Now, impeachment does not mean removal. Impeachment is a censuring of the president and saying that he stepped out of line. It's sort of like a punishment for the president, if you will. Actual removal requires both houses of Congress. So the House and the Senate would have to both agree in order to remove an impeached president. In our history, we have never impeached and removed a president, but we have impeached multiple presidents where the House has agreed, yeah, you stepped out of line, you deserve some form of negative consequence here. Now, how the legislative branch interacts with the judicial branch. The legislative branch creates constitutional amendments sometimes that can override Supreme Court decisions. If the Supreme Court rules something unconstitutional, in other words, the legislative branch could get together and actually make it constitutional. Now, that would be very time-consuming. They'd have to get the majority of them to agree on it. And because of those two facts right there, it doesn't happen all that often. They can also refuse judicial appointments. So if they don't agree with the appointment of a particular judge, they can block it. But they do have to have a majority in order to do that. They can impeach and remove judges, so that creates some control over the quality of the judicial branch. They can also create additional lower courts as needed. Now the judicial branch. They can rule that a presidential action is unconstitutional and thereby step in the way of the president doing it. Judges appointed by a president serve for life, whereas a president's term is limited. So judges are going to be around much longer than presidents. That gives the judicial branch a little bit more power than it would have if judges were only appointed president by president. And think about that logically. If Supreme Court judges got appointed and removed by each president, every time the U.S. switched which party is in control of the executive branch, we'd be switching out our judicial branch, and it would all be people that that particular party likes. That'd be pretty problematic. So that's why we do lifetime appointment for judges. Now, how the judicial branch interacts with the legislative branch. The judicial branch interprets laws. So legislative branch writes them, judicial branch then interprets them. They also can rule that laws are unconstitutional, so they can strike down something that was written into law by the legislative branch. So how might this play out in real life? These checks and balances. Let's say we've got our president, and maybe the president's bored one day and he feels like invading Canada. Can he do it? No, he cannot. Absolutely not. Why? Because, first of all, he would have to have approval from the legislative branch, which has the right to declare wars. And also, he would have to be following the laws, and he would be breaking the law, which means the judicial branch would be after him. So if the president wanted to do something that's not constitutional or something that's not within his power to do, he's got two other branches of government that are going to immediately be after him. At the very least, one branch of government, because the Supreme Court doesn't always get involved. But if the president breaks the law, you can bet the legislative branch will be on it. Next concept or principle of government is judicial review. This is what allows the judicial branch to decide on punishments that government officials deserve. It's an important idea because if the president, for example, broke the law, we need a way to hold him accountable. So, if the president broke the law, judicial review allows for a court to decide what consequences the president deserves to have. We have a formal process for this. What judicial review does is it puts into practice this essential idea that no government official is above the law of the citizens. The laws that we as citizens follow also have to be followed by the people who govern us. It's pretty well expressed in this little political cartoon. Let's say you've got lawbreakers and members of Congress that want to do things that are not constitutional. That's where we've got ways of countering it, and we have judicial referees. All right, next principle of government, federalism. Federalism is the idea of splitting political power between a large group and smaller groups. So in our case, we split power between our state governments and our national or federal government. We have 50 individual state governments, one federal government. And we also have local governments on top of that. The state government is in charge of just those who live within that state, although sometimes states try to take a little power that doesn't actually belong to them. And then our national government controls everyone who lives in the nation. If you watched my other mini lesson that looked over the types of powers, then this slide here will make a lot more sense to you. But Americans live under both national and state governments. There are national powers that the federal government has. There are state powers that the state government has, or reserved powers. And then there are concurrent or shared powers that both have. And you can see there's a few examples listed of each. Now, in the past, the way that American federalism worked was kind of like a layer cake. The programs and authority were clearly divided among the national, state, and local governments. There was this very obvious divide between what the federal government did, what the state government did, and what smaller governments like county governments or city governments did. That's layer cake federalism. What we have now in the present day is what they call marble cake federalism. Programs and authority are mixed among the national, state, and local governments. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these concepts. Well, that finishes our look at the principles of government.